Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. This is 169, where we read and review philosophy papers on the internets. Live. So let's see. Because America and Black Lives Matter, let's do some philosophy of race today, just because that's what we're doing this week. Seems like what everyone's doing this week. Philosophy of race. Let's see what else we can read in the philosophy of race. Yeah, so business ethics. It's like labor relations. So let's see, what else do we got. Okay, these are all the contemporary political philosophy stuff. Is what's it called? They did a bunch of reviews, so I'm not gonna look at those. It seems to be a thing to do is just go a few pages in here and see if there's anything I missed. Actually, I had some stuff saved. I had this one, and I also had, let's see, what was this one? Spectral Perception of Ghostly Subjectivity at the Colonial Gender Race Sex Nexus. I mean, it's hard to beat a title like that. And then we had this one, which was, I read this far into it. It's winner of the American Philosophical Association's Essay Prize. So, you know what, let's do the Essay Prize winner. Because why not? It's award-winning. It means it's won an award. So. Oh, there's something else. Defeated ambivalence. One of the authors, I usually send the authors an email telling them I made a review of their paper. One of the authors was kind enough to send over some suggestions for readings in the philosophy race, so I'm thinking about doing that. Although I'm not entirely sure how some of them look a little long. It's like I don't want to be going for hours and hours. If you're in the chat, you can grab the link there. It's there now. Otherwise, you can get it if you show up later by typing !paper into the chat. Otherwise, it'll be in the show notes. The link will be there if you're watching later, like on the YouTubes or just on Twitch. Let's see. Okay, so we've got the virtues of Mestizaje, maybe. I apologize for how I say everything, and everything else. Okay, the virtues of Mestizaje, maybe? Lessons from the last Casas on Aztec human sacrifice. Winner of something. Okay. Introduction. Western imperialism has received many different types of moral political justifications, but one of the most historically influential justifications appeals to an allegedly universal form of human nature. In the early modern period, this traditional conception of human nature, based on Western archetype, for example Spanish, Dutch, British, French, German, opens up a logical space for considering the inhabitants of previously unknown lands as having a less than human nature. This appeal to human nature originally found its inspiration in the philosophy of Aristotle, whose ethical thought pervaded the work of European philosophers at the outset of the early modern period and the modern age of empire. Indeed, some Spanish writers, most famously Juan Gines de Sepulveda, explicitly appealed to Aristotle's moral political philosophy in order to justify the conquest of the Americas in the early 16th century, for instance, to justify war against the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples. At the time of European arrival, the Aztec civilization was easily the greatest in Mesoamerica, and yet Europeans generally considered the Aztec people to be barbaric, that is, less than fully human. Despite Aristotle's association with the history of Western imperialism, the past 40 years in moral philosophy have seen an explosion in interest in Aristotle's ethics. especially the idea that virtues are indispensable to a good human life. Today, proponents of an Aristotelian ethics can insist that Aristotle's appeal to human nature can easily allow for and even celebrate the wide variety of lifestyles found in different cultural historical contexts that can allow for a more flexible conception of the ways in which human nature is realized in different cultures and historical moments. Several philosophers have even developed accounts of previously overlooked virtues that people will need under conditions of oppression or social marginalization, conditions that are often the result of intercultural imperialism. These recent developments flow naturally from an Aristotelian orientation, and such developments could lead us to consider further whether the assumptions that enabled Western imperialism might linger enough today to influence contemporary conceptions of the virtues. For instance, unreflective assumptions about European cultural supremacy and American exceptionalism. Alright, so a little history here and setting the stage. So what's going to happen? My main hypothesis here is that such unreflective and deep-seated cultural prejudices have shaped Western development of Aristotelian ethics in various ways, as already illustrated in Sepulveda's appeal to Aristotelian natural slaves, and that such prejudices partially explain the felt need for an extra ethical foundation for the virtues, one provided by a universal and morally determinative form of human nature. An acknowledgement of the actual world historical development of Aristotelian ethics would therefore be a first but crucial step towards developing a more modest intercultural version of contemporary neo-Aristotelian ethics, an approach that aims precisely in its open-endedness and epistemological humility to supersede any form of imperialism. Such cultural prejudices can obscure a more plausible and open-ended version, an intercultural and self-consciously mestizo version of a plausible neo-Aristotelian ethics. Okay, so they're going to try to rehabilitate Aristotelian ethics. That's very ambitious. But I guess it did it because it won some award. What I will argue in this paper much more specifically, and I apologize for being snarky, sometimes just happen to be snarky. What I have argued in this paper much more superficially is, specifically, not superficially, is that a consideration of the actual historical collision of these two radically different belief systems, Christian and Aztec, reveals the possibility, even in the early modern period, of a helpful dialogical Aristotelianism, one that strains to understand from within the perspective of alien others. This dialogical Aristotelianism disavows an epistemology of ignorance. It disavows the need not to know, the motivation not to learn, something that is arguably essential to Eurocentrism. A dialogical Aristotelianism strongly suggests that a philosophical version of Mestizaje can enrich the best philosophical account of the virtues we have, both now and in future research on moral character. I will return to what, in my view, this type of philosophical admixture will fruitfully include in section 5 below. Okay. The Aztecs as alien others. In order to illustrate this dialogical version of Aristotelian ethics, I will discuss two of the central arguments deployed by Bartolomé de las Casas in defense of Aztec human sacrifice. This defense was originally delivered in front of the Council of the Indies, a tribunal convened in 1550 by Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, in order to determine the fate of the native inhabitants of the Indies, our Americas. The question before the council was whether waging war against the native inhabitants of the Indies was morally justified in order to convert them to the Christian faith. This question seems urgent given the apparent barbaric nature of the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples, something most notably demonstrated by the religiously sanctioned practice of human sacrifice and the equally morbid practice, or so it was believed, of consuming the flesh of the sacrificial victims. Despite these apparent barbaric practices, which genuinely horrified 16th century Europeans, Las Casas defended the rationality of the Aztec way of life. The discussion here should not, of course, be thought to question the gruesome nature of the Aztec human sacrifice. One recent historian, drawing on authoritative sources, offers this lurid description. In a typical ritual, the helpless individual was confronted with the sight of the great sacrificial stone stained with blood, which also matted the hair of the magnificently adorned priests. Seized by these gory apparitions, the victim was stretched backwards over the stone altar, each limb extended by a priest so that the back was arched and the chest stretched taut and raised high towards the heavens. A fifth priest struck open the chest with an obsidian knife, excised the heart with knife and hand, and raised the fertile offering to the heavens, displaying to the gods the sacrificial fruit. Well, that does sound, this is pretty gruesome. Lurid, yes. Let's go with haven't seen Lurid in a philosophy paper, and don't know how long or ever, but I mean, as far as philosophy papers go, they get very dry. That's why I like pictures, and this is sort of fun, like a historical thing. Even if it's lurid, it definitely gives you a kick. You should think about stuff like that. Las Casas addressed the question of whether it would be just to wage war against the Aztecs in the name of Christianity in order to end this practice to spare the lives of the innocent victims. The answer he gives is no. Las Casas' defiant approach to these issues already shows in his response to a different Spanish pretext for a war. According to this different justification, war against the indigenous peoples is justified because they are guilty of killing Christians and they are guilty of thwarting the spread of Christianity. Las Casas provides a sharp response. It highlights the contemporary relevance of thinking through his arguments, for instance, their relevance in evaluating past and present U.S. policy towards indigenous people and their descendants. In response to this initial pretext for war, that war is justified because the Indians kill Christians and prevent the spread of the gospel, Las Casas responds that although the Indians have indeed killed Christians, they have not killed them as Christians, like qua Christians. Rather, the Indians kill Christians qua perpetrators of violence, theft, rape, torture, and murder. This insightful distinction is a distinction of which any Aristotelian can be justly proud. Its contemporary relevance should be obvious. Okay, so he's saying, look, they killed them not because they were Christians, they killed them because they broke the law, basically. They did bad things, and that's why they attacked. It's a very reasonable response is to have a fight back when people are attacking you. On Aristotelian endoxa. Overall, Las Casas argues that the Aztec way of life cannot be excused in the sight of God, that the Mexica are not objectively correct about the propriety of human sacrifice, but that it can completely be excused in the sight of men. What this means is that no one can justifiably blame the Aztecs for their violent religious practices, but certainly not the Spaniards. No one can justify them, and including not the Spaniards, I guess. Thus, the following line of inquiry with which Casas opens his discussion of human sacrifice is certainly intended to sting. Las Casas says that it would not be right to make war on them for this reason. This is because it is difficult to absorb in a short time the truth proclaimed to them. Why would they believe such a proud, greedy, cruel, and rapacious nation? Why would they give up the religion of their ancestors, unanimously approved for so many centuries and supported by the authority of their teachers? Yeah, so why would you want to be subject to Spain in like the 1500s? That sounds terrible. I mean, especially if you're not Spanish. In this passage, Las Casas gestures towards the first of his two main arguments here, which is that the Aztecs are committing what he calls a probable error. In explaining the nature of a probable error, as he sees it, Las Casas makes a direct reference to Aristotle's Topics, Book 1. Las Casas insists that, as the philosopher says, that is said to be probable which is approved by all men, either the majority of wise men or by those whose wisdom has the greatest following. What is this reference to Aristotle? At the outset of the Topics, one of his logical treatises, Aristotle distinguishes between two types of deductions or syllogisms. He calls the first type a demonstration, and he calls the second type a dialectical deduction. Aristotle explains the distinction in the very passage Las Casas cites. Now, a deduction, syllogismos, is an argument in which certain things being laid down, something other than these necessarily come about through them. It is a demonstration when the premises from which the deduction starts are true and primitive, or are such that our knowledge of them has really come through premises which are primitive and true. And it is a dialectical deduction if it reasons from reputable opinions. And endoxon, exodoxon. Okay, so either it's going to be just necessary, or it's a reason, or it comes from it's of assumption of some sense, from a reputable thing to assume. Aristotle goes on to explain what he means by saying that in the case of dialectical deductions, the premises are reputable opinions. The Greek word here is endoxa, sometimes translated as probable assumptions. Regarding such endoxa, Aristotle says that those opinions are reputable which are 1, accepted by everyone, or 2, by the majority, or 3, by the wise, that is, by all, or by the majority, or by the most notable and reputable of them. This means that dialectical deductions will differ from demonstrations, for demonstrations begin with the premises that are, or derive from premises that are, true and primitive. That is, demonstrations begin from the premises which, like each of the first principles in an Aristotelian science, should command belief in and by itself. Oh yeah, if anyone has any questions out there, please feel free to ask. By contrast, a dialectical deduction will proceed from endoxa. It will proceed from those reputable opinions or modest human starting points, which, as Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics, are the only appropriate starting points in ethics. In a practical subject like ethics, the appropriate starting points are the ethical opinions that are accepted by everyone, or by the majority, or by the wise. We must start from things that are evident to us. Our starting points in ethics will certainly never have the epistemological firmness of premises that are true and primitive. Rather, our starting points in ethics can only amount to the best ethical judgments that we and our society have managed to arrive at so far, the ethical judgments that seem most evident to us. This will be a subject that, as a historical matter, merits our ongoing ethical reflection. Las Casas' explicit recognition of Aristotle's ethical methodology, along with the way he utilizes this methodology in defense of the Aztec way of life, for instance by castigating the ethical outlook of his fellow Spaniards, indicates that Las Casas interprets Aristotle's ethics in terms of what I have characterized elsewhere as an internal validation of the virtues of character. An internal validation of the virtues of character disavow any external appeal to a universal and morally determinative form of human nature from which one could derive a specific conception of the virtues of character. The general form of this different type of validation, an external validation of the virtues, manifests itself most obviously in interpretations of Aristotle that appeal to an allegedly metaphysical biology or other form of natural teleology, usually culminating in a naturalist conception of well-being or flourishing. By contrast, Las Casas seems to recognize that Aristotle's ethical project can be understood as significantly more modest than that. Indeed, Las Casas seems to follow Aristotle down this different philosophical path. This more modest Aristotelianism would certainly explain the sharp contrast between the charitable hermeneutical understanding deployed by Las Casas, even with respect to human sacrifice, and the quite different apology for conquest deployed by Sepulveda, that is, an apology for conquest that exhibits a form of willful hermeneutic ignorance, especially but not only in its appeal to natural slavery. Alright, so the argument here is due to Aristotle's method, when you're talking about ethics, you have to look at who you think has the best opinions. Is it everybody, or is it the wise, or whatever? But you're getting opinions, and they're necessarily opinions because they're not questions of like obvious science or something. And so if you're, as Las Casas employed it, he was saying that, look, according to this sort of Aristotelian viewpoint, if you're going to talk about ethics, those people aren't doing anything ethically wrong because all their society is based around these ethical principles, and so we can't fault them for this sort of relative, because it's a relative sort of thing. If they're looking at what is the practice and who they consider wise, then they may be mistaken because they're not Christian, but that doesn't matter because we can't fault them, they didn't know. So it was this relative sort of argument based on how ethics is understood in an Aristotelian sense. Okay. The limitations of the natural light. Las Casas also argues that it is not easy to convince even rational people to abandon their cultural heritage in a short amount of time, especially given only the resources provided by natural light of reason, that is, without the further epistemological resources that Las Casas believes are provided by faith, grace, and doctrine, and usually guns in the case of like 1500s Spain. Waging war on the Aztecs would therefore be unjustified because it is difficult to absorb in a short time the truth proclaimed to them. Here, Las Casas emphasized that the natural light of reason displays epistemological limitations, that in the absence of divine revelation, natural reason seems to provide justificatory reason in favor of human sacrifice. This is a sort of relativism here. Because if it's relative to the wise in your culture, then this is a relative thing. So the Aztecs would then be like, well, of course it's reasonable to kill people as a religious practice. In what follows, I want to mention 3 possible strategies for supporting this second line of defense. Las Casas employs the first 2 strategies in the defense. His avoiding the third one must have been determined by facts on the ground. First, Las Casas appeals to biblical and historical precedents of human sacrifice that seem to illustrate its consistency with natural reason. He cites biblical episodes apparently indicating that God sometimes requires or permits human sacrifice. He also cites episodes of human sacrifice within Western civilizations, for instance among the Greeks, Romans, and even our own Spaniards. Second, Las Casas argues that natural reason seems to require sacrificing humans to God. He proceeds by first establishing four principles, mostly by appeals to theological and philosophical authorities. 1. No nation is so barbarous that it does not have at least some confused knowledge of God. 2. People are led by natural inclination to worship God according to their capabilities in their own ways. 3. There is no better way to worship God than by sacrifice, which is the principle of latria, adoration. 4. Offering sacrifice to the true God or to one who is thought to be God comes from the natural law, whereas the things that to be offered to God are a matter of human law and positive legislation. From these principles, Las Casas derives the conclusion of the natural light of reason, given that no earthly thing is more valuable than human life. He writes, therefore, nature itself dictates and teaches those who do not have faith, grace, or doctrine, who live within the limitations of the light of nature, that in spite of every contrary positive law, they ought to sacrifice victims to the true God or to the false God who is thought to be true, so that by offering a supremely precious thing they might be more grateful for the many favors they have received. A similar conclusion might also be reached by a direct appeal to Christianity as follows. Third, Las Casas might have emphasized something that he does indeed mention, that Christianity itself essentially involves human sacrifice. Hence, the activity of human sacrifice cannot by itself be any sign of barbarism and cannot be contrary to the natural light of reason. The charitable view would be that the Aztecs are only partially mistaken here, in the absence of divine revelation, since the sacrificial debt has already been paid in the person of Jesus Christ. Moreover, as I myself would emphasize, if one takes seriously the Roman Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread and wine of the Eucharist are not mere representations of the body and the blood of Christ, but they literally are the body and blood of Christ, then Christianity also involves a form of cannibalism. Yeah, it's always I've heard that before. I hadn't heard of that in a while. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Everyone in like church is kind of cannibalistic in that sense. It's very sort of it's not. I don't know if it's well advertised. What each of these strategies demonstrates is the possibility of a radical form of hermeneutical charity, even regarding the allegedly barbarous practices of the Aztec people. Gustavo Gutierrez nicely summarizes this in his magisterial study of Las Casas. Gutierrez writes, by attending to the customs, lifestyles, and religious freedoms of the Incas, Las Casas created the necessary conditions for a dialogue to be conducted in respect for both parties. In this manner of dialogue, reason, not undue pressure, makes possible an integral presentation of the gospel message. Now that message is offered without prejudice to the values of one proclaiming it, for the free acceptance of each hearer. Such a dialogue will respect the rational freedom of both parties. It will also involve not only the giving of reasons, but also the taking of them. If evangelization is a dialogue, it will not exist without an effort to understand the position of one's interlocutor from within, in such a way that one may sense the vital thrust of these positions and grasp their internal logic. Neither will it be possible unless one is ready to give as well as to receive. This passage characterizes the dialogical approach to ethics that I am urging, but without any appeal to the supernatural. Although we should certainly be wary in intercultural contexts of any appeal to evangelization, Las Casas' radical hermeneutical charity advances the discussion here. Las Casas demonstrates the central virtue involved in a philosophical version of Mestizaje, a radical hermeneutical charity that constitutes a distinctive form of epistemic justice. This epistemic virtue disavows an epistemology of ignorance by recognizing and, where appropriate, encouraging philosophical admixture. This philosophical admixture will occur, in my view, in at least the following two ways. First, it will occur across spatio-cultural geography and between different philosophical and cultural academic communities. This is a kind of cross-pollination, something that seems to be more often lauded than practiced. Second, it will occur across world historical time as a result of one's own historical, that is, genetic philosophical inheritance, an inheritance that shapes one's overall philosophical outlook, one's framework of thought, This is a kind of dialogue with the past. In the final section, I gestured toward a more rounded view of each of these. Alright, so the argument here is that if you're going to take seriously how you understand reasoning in terms of ethics, then you have to do it in terms of what you consider wise. And then granted, even then, so you can do a rational reconstruction of other people's arguments given just minor little tweaks to show that they are being pretty rational, even according to your own lights, and maybe only making the most minor errors. And even in the case of Christianity, they may be not even errors. Maybe they're just interpreting it differently. As they said, was said over here, it's that the sacrifice had already been paid, but of course the people did not know that in the other part of the world, because how could they, without divine revelation? Sure. So now, it seems reasonable, but so the question is, I'm always worried about Aristotelian stuff, and this has nothing to do with this author or this paper. It's just, you can always, who gets to pick and choose which virtues are the right ones. Now, this is good. This paper is good because it doesn't actually pick and choose various virtues to say, well, these are the right virtues, these are the best virtues, and we should follow those. This starts from the logic, and therefore how to reason about the virtues, and that then is a suggestion for what to do, but it's different. So it's different. Okay, so let's see how this gets a little bit more filled out. Epistemic justice. So the question is, this is trying to read into the ethics from the logical reasoning literature, though. The question is, how does that work? In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle restricts the audience of his ethical lectures on the grounds that those who engage in moral philosophy must have been well brought up or brought up in good habits. What is less frequently noticed is that this requirement to have appropriately ethical starting points and to have a character sufficiently well formed that one is not swayed by, for instance, unruly desires, is also one that applies to Aristotle himself and to Aristotelian moral philosophers in general, since they are also engaged in the practice of moral philosophy. But in the aftermath of the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan, apologize for how I say things, and other parts of Americas, Aristotelian's moral philosophy did not generally embrace the dialogical approach advocated by Las Casas. I believe we need to trace the history of the damage done to moral philosophy in the long historical interim. By way of analogy, consider an episode of European barbarism recorded from the perspective of Aztec witnesses immediately before the fall of Mexico. In this episode, Spanish soldiers blocked the exits during a festive religious gathering, allowing the soldiers to massacre the participants. This gruesome episode seems to be taking inspiration from something in Homer and giving inspiration to something in George R.R. Martin, except that this actual historical episode involves gross violations of human dignity. And when they had closed them off, they then entered the temple courtyard to slay them. They surrounded those who danced, whereupon they went among the drums. Then they struck the arms of those who beat the drums. They severed both his hands and afterwards struck his neck, so that his neck and head flew off, falling far away. Of some they struck the belly, and their entrails streamed forth. When one in vain would run, he would only drag his entrails like something raw as he tried to flee. And the blood of the chieftains ran like water. It spread out slippery, and a foul odor rose from the blood. And the entrails lay as if dragged out. And the Spaniards walked everywhere, searching the tribal temples. They went making thrusts everywhere in case someone were hidden there. Everywhere they went, ransacking every tribal temple they hunted. Ultimately, it is unclear whether the Anglo-American moral philosophy has displayed an understanding of cultural others that has been much better than the understanding displayed in this historical episode. Whether intentional or not, mainstream Anglo-American philosophy has been remarkably effective at securing its borders against what many of its practitioners consider to be alien influences. This includes influences from other cultures and from demographics other than the dominantly situated demographic in the profession, from other academic disciplines, for instance history, sociology, and anthropology, although this is improving in some quarters, and from philosophical methodologies other than methodologies developed within Anglo-American philosophy in the early and mid-20th century, and still insisted upon by some philosophers today as the defining mark of any genuine philosophy. Indeed, some philosophers seem to be eerily at home with such history of Western imperialism. This is a history that such philosophers seem to think can be neatly left in the past in such a way that they and their favored research projects can continue to benefit from centuries of past injustice. Obviously, I cannot fully develop these suggestions here. Instead of doing so, I will emphasize something that I think is utterly crucial for developing a plausible neo-Aristotelian ethics informed by an intercultural perspective. This is a radical form of cultural self-scrutiny, especially a scrutiny of the ethical and epistemic prejudices that are embedded within our social historical framework of thought, a framework of thought that is, of course, usually taken for granted. It ceases to be taken for granted, or can do so, when it comes into contact with radically alternative frameworks, ones that are culturally or historically distant from our own current location. To put the point differently, contemporary moral philosophers need to pay greater attention to history in at least two senses. We need a better understanding of the history of the historicity of philosophy, an understanding of the former that is not willfully inaccurate and that disavows the arrogance of knowing only one's own philosophical tradition. We also need a better appreciation of our current place in history and our cultural particularity, a critical understanding of the framework of thought that can, of course, be seen inevitable to us. This would be a form of neo-Aristotelian ethics that takes seriously those genealogical approaches that still remain very much against the current and contemporary moral philosophy. It would also be a form of Aristotelian ethics in better appreciating our current globalized, multicultural, post-colonial, neo-colonial place in history strains to embody the virtues of epistemic justice. Yeah, that strains to embody the virtues of epistemic justice. Okie dokie. Yeah. Well, let's see. What was interesting here? Okay, so this one had lurid historical anecdotes, which is something you don't normally get in philosophy. The question is, I mean, it really did make the paper more entertaining to read, as opposed to just the like all the like if phi is a psi and psi is phi and phi one. Oh God, I've done that so many times. I'm just like, stop with the phi's and psi's. You don't need to make everything into a formula. And I'm guilty of that too. But this is a pulling in different historical sort of vignettes, I guess, and then also using Las Casas, which was, I think, was from 1550, which is a good while ago now, but not really. In terms of philosophy, 1550 is not actually that long ago. It's just modern philosophy. So that's not anything unusual, really. But the argument that we've got an Aristotelian relativism is that is something a little bit different. So arguing from the cultural relativity of those the majority, or those you take to be the wise, and then getting their opinion as to understand how to do the virtues, then is a different sort of relativism you don't normally get in Aristotelianism and neo-Aristotelian ethics, because you tend to look to the virtues. Now, in Aristotle, of course, you have the good habits and whatnot, and so that is a requirement. But I think the tradition has generally just taken it to be that these are some sort of abstract things, and you're not looking to other people and definitely not other cultures to define what counts as a virtue. So that is an interesting Aristotelian relativism based off the dialectical logical approach of how you are reasoning. So instead of just taking things from first principles, which would be more metaphysical, this is taking things from the opinions of people, which are taken to be reasonable opinions of people, or the better opinions. So this is then framed as an epistemic justice thing. Like, if you, since we don't actually have a good grasp of what counts as who's all the ways the wise, then we have to be much more modest in our appreciation of what we think is the right way of going, and how to understand other philosophies and other cultures, for that matter. So, anybody out there has questions, please let me know. In terms of argument, yeah, this is a different sort of thing. So we've got this sort of historically situated setup here, talking about Las Casas and a case of the Las Casas arguing to, I guess, the Spanish crown about going to war. And then in that sort of framework, the arguments were embedded according to Las Casas, I guess, own argument. I don't think it's exactly according to Las Casas, but it's sort of embedded alongside that argument to then bring out the point of epistemic humility or modesty, I guess, what was it, just epistemic justice, as part of the Aristotelian program, according to how Las Casas argued for it. So that's an interesting argumentative strategy. So we've got sort of a historical vignette with the philosophical argument sort of structured along with that. So that's actually quite interesting as far as how to write a philosophy paper, which is nice, different. I like that. Let's see. Now the question is this also a question, like, they sort of are arguing that the current dominant structure of like how philosophy is done is not a good thing, but more needs to be done, like in this area over here, and obviously kind of fully develop how to do that. But the question is, how do you bring in influences? And so maybe this sort of structural thing in terms of how the paper is structured and written might be actually sort of a starting point, that you could use these sort of like historical vignettes and arguments to update and you could update those things to be a modern sort of account of this. And then you get to do fun things like you pull in lurid examples from the past, which are always fun. Yeah, so this is an interestingly written paper. It makes an interesting point about Aristotle. I don't know if anyone, I mean, just like knowing people, like of course the author is right. People resist changing the way they do things. This is a much bigger problem than just like, oh yeah, we should of course look at other reasonings, but there's like a whole like academic business that is tied into the way things are done right now. So it's very hard to change like the structures. But as with all this sort of structural inequalities that we've been discussing lately. So I guess it's an argument for Aristotelian relativism, and it's also an argument for sort of a more situated approach to philosophy, which are two good ways of doing it. And I like the way it was brought out by this sort of the way the paper was written too. So that's kind of a very interesting paper, actually. So thanks for watching, everyone. Stay safe out there. I'll be back again tonight with, I guess I'll be at 170 of these reviews. Actually, technically I missed the number 16, so 169 still. This is 160, the 168th I've done. Okay, so thank you. Stay safe out there and have a great day. Bye-bye. Oh, really?